na 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 re ra re ra na na na. Bahudari has been one of my absolute favorite ragas from quite a young age. சின்ன வயசில் வந்து நம்ம பாட்டு கிளாஸ் போவோம். We learn different songs, we learn different ragas. But it's not until you reach a certain age and, some level of maturity that you begin to really, truly appreciate what you're learning. And, start developing some sort of personal relationship with the music. So, for me, the very first raga with which I felt like I had this, deep connection with was Bahudari. So I was in 6th standard. I grew up in Bangalore and we lived in this area called Basveshwar Nagar, and I would walk to class. I would walk to music class. It was about like a 12 to 15 minute walk. And there was this one day, I vividly remember to this day, I was walking back home from Pata class, and my teacher then, Ranganayaki Mami, she had just taught me Brova Barama. And I remember walking back home and humming that, that song and just thinking to myself, wow, this just sounds so beautiful. So yeah, that was the very first time when I felt like, something that I learned in music class really struck such a deep chord with me. Interestingly and probably surprisingly, when I think about early influences in Bahudari on me, I don't recall any specific recordings of, like great musicians, senior musicians. My dad would play a lot of music at home. But one recording, has really stuck with me. And it was an album by the great Mridangam Vidwan Karekudi Mani. So it was a Layam-oriented album. And there were like 4 or 5 tracks, each one highlighting a different talam. And it was all percussion instruments, except that there was one main sort of melody, like a tune played on the flute by N. Ramani. And the Aditalam track had Bahudari. So it went like this. Padani pa gaba maga sani samaga gama gaza gama padani pa gaba maga sani samaga sa sa ga ga ma ma pa padani sani ni pa maga sa ga ma ni pa sa 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 ga 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 ma 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 pa pa pa. So that's one Bahudari sort of influence from very early on that has stayed with me. Something that makes Bahudari sort of, I guess, extra special for me is there were 2 distinct occasions when something very interesting happened. For the classically and Carnatic trained mind, when you hear a piece of music, you immediately, your mind goes to identify the ragam, right? And then the appreciation follows, or maybe they happen at the same time. So for instance, it may be like, aha, ennamma thodi padra. Or like, wow, what a begada, right? But what was interesting that happened to me with Bahudari in these 2 different occasions was that the emotional appeal, the aesthetic appeal came first, and the recognition of the raga came later. And this was, what makes it interesting is that this was at a stage when I had fully understood Bahudari, like I was aware of it, I had learned it, and I knew exactly how it goes. But still, for a split second, of course, the time lag between the 2, the aesthetic or emotional appreciation and the recognition of the raga was not much. It was quite small, but still it was interesting that, the raga recognition came later. So one happened when I was in college. I was in this close friend's house. We were sitting in her basement listening to some music, and she had played some, it was some fusion violin thing. And, this one track was playing and I was like, wow, it had that immediate impact. And then I realized, oh, it had that impact because it is Bahudari. And that track was by the great Ganesh Kumaresh from an album called Spark, if I remember correctly. And this particular track was called Veera. I think it's still available on YouTube if you want to check it out. The second instance when this happened was when I was listening to Singalathu Chinnakoile, again around the same time, when I was in college, from the film Punnagai Mannan, of course, composed by the one and only Ilayaraja. You may be like, Singalathu Chinnakoile and Bahudari, like what is the connection? Yes, the Pallavi has nothing to do with Bahudari, but the Charanams are sort of in Bahudari, and what highlights that even more is the second interlude. So the second interlude goes like na 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 ni sa ga ma pa sa pa ma ga ma pa ga ni sa da da ni pa pa da ma sa ga ma pa ga ni sa da da ni pa pa da ma sa ga ma pa na 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 So that is very like Bahudari-esque, right? So yeah, it was very interesting that on both these occasions that emotional appeal happened first, maybe like a split second before I realized that, oh, okay, wow, this is actually Bahudari, right? That usually doesn't happen. Many years after learning Brova Bharama, I learned another composition in Bahudari by my subsequent teacher, Lakshmi Mami. She belonged to the GNB school and she taught me many of GNB's compositions, and this was one of them. So it goes, Unnadiye gatiyen radaindhen taaye, Unnadiye gatiyen radaindhen, Unmai nee ariyayo, உலகநாயகியே உன்னடியே. இதில் வந்து அனுப்பல்லவி இட் கோஸ் பன்னக பூஷணம் பன்னக மபதனி. I have this pet peeve about Bahudari. Actually, any raga that's kind of close to me, I have some strong views on how it should be treated. So according to me, a scale-based raga like Bahudari, romba asacha, somehow it's not to my liking, that very heavy kampita gamakam. So inga vandu and ma padani and the ma vandu avlo gamakam kodukradhu, somehow it never appealed to me. So I prefer singing it as pannaga bhushana. I also am not a fan of anchoring on the ma in Bahudari for some reason. I like to come back to that ga. The ma padani sa apdi padina, it takes me to Hari Kamboji. Of course Bahudari is a jandim of Hari Kamboji, but somehow I don't like, I'm not a big fan of that way of rendering Bahudari. It's like sometimes we are close to some relatives, we are not as fond of other relatives, and the madri with Bahudari I feel like Bahudari is better off being closer to this part of our family. I associate Bahudari more with like the Tilang, Jog, Chalanata, that trajectory, than the Hari Kamboji side of the family. So anyway, that's just a completely personal, subjective preference. It's not like you're violating any rule by shaking that ma like that. Anyway, many years after that, I learned, the beautiful Varnam Yanto Prema by the legendary Lalgudi Jayaraman Mama from my guru Lalgudi Rajalakshmi Mami. And after learning that Varnam, I realized how naive I had been, because back in college I tried, composing a Varnam in Bahudari. And now I just feel like laughing when I think back about that. Composing as in, I'm not proficient enough in any Indian language to write the lyrics, so I've collaborated with my mom on a number of songs. She writes the words in Tamil and I sort of and I tune it. So in the case of this Varnam, I sort of come up with the swaras and the musical structure, and she wrote the words for it. But I'll spare you, I don't intend to sing it now. But the first line of that Varnam and the Pallavi, or the first line mattum, many years later, I took that as the Pallavi line in a concert. So I'll just sing that one line and leave you with that. So Kanda Triputa. Kanna untayeruvar மூலகின் தாய் நீ என்றோ கண்ணா உன் தாயேருவர் மூலகின் தாய் நீ என்றோ கண்ணா உன் தாயேருவர். So, what is your take on Bahudari? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next edition of Ragas and Reminiscences.